Picture this. It is the autumn of 844 AD. The sun over Seville burns copper and gold. The Guadalquivir River, the great artery of southern Spain, glitters under a cloudless Andalusian sky. Merchants haul silk, scholars debate philosophy, the call to prayer echoes off whitewashed walls. Life, as it has been for decades, feels untouchable, eternal, and then they appear, longships, dozens of them. Low in the water, silent as sharks, their dragon prows cutting through the river mist like blades through smoke. 80 vessels, some accounts say. Others claim more. It doesn't matter. What matters is what's on board. Hundreds of battle-hardened Norse warriors, men who had already burned Rouen, sacked Nantes, raided the riverlands of Francia, and terrorized the coasts of England and Ireland. Men who had rarely, and never easily, been stopped. The people of Seville had heard the legends of the Magus, the broad Arabic term chroniclers used for northern pagans, originally meaning magians or fire worshippers. Pagans from the frozen north, monsters of the sea. Most believed those monsters lived in another world, a world far away. They were wrong. Within days, the governor of Seville had fled. The citizens who tried to resist, untrained, unled, desperate, were cut down like wheat. And then the city fell. One of the richest and most sophisticated cities in western Iberia had been taken by men wielding axes and shouting war cries in a tongue few in Andalusia had ever heard. The Vikings had done the impossible. But here is what they didn't know. Here is the brutal truth no Norse saga ever told. The city they had just looted? It was not just a city. It was the jewel of an empire. And the man who ruled that empire, he was not a trembling king, surrounded by priests and prayers. He was Emir Abd al-Rahman II, one of the most capable rulers of Umayyad al-Andalus, and he was already moving. What happened next, on the fields of Tablada, on the banks of the Guadalquivir, traditionally dated to November 11th, 844 AD, though some reckonings place the final defeat a few days later, is one of the most dramatic and forgotten military routes of the Viking Age. The Vikings came for gold. They found annihilation. Before we go any further, if you are new here, this channel exists for one reason, to tell the real stories of war, not the sanitized version, not the myth, the brutal, unvarnished truth of what happened when civilizations collided and blood was spilled. If that is what you are here for, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss a single battle. And if this video moves you, if it teaches you something you didn't know before, drop a like. It costs you nothing, but it keeps this channel alive. Now, let's go back to 844 AD. To understand why the Battle of Tablada was so extraordinary, you first need to understand the world in which it took place. Because 844 AD was not just any year in history. It was the high water mark of an age of chaos, an age when the old certainties of civilization were being shredded by forces no one had planned for. In the north, the great Carolingian Empire, the empire built by Charlemagne, was tearing itself apart. Louis the Pious, Charlemagne's son, had died in 840 AD, and his heirs were at each other's throats in a brutal civil war. One of those heirs, Lothair, had reportedly even invited Viking warbands into Frankish territory as mercenaries. The wolves were being let inside the walls, and they liked what they saw, because by the early 840s, the Vikings were no longer just coastal thieves. They were mobile warbands capable of striking deep inland. Their longships, marvels of engineering capable of crossing open oceans and navigating shallow rivers alike, had given them a mobility that no army of the time could match. Between 841 and 843 AD, Norse fleets had burned Rouen, sacked Nantes, and pushed deep into the Garonne and Loire river valleys of France. They had turned the coastlines of England and Ireland into bleeding wounds that never seemed to close. Christian kings prayed, bishops wept. Some communities were already learning that walls, prayers, and local levies could all fail against them. The Viking world at this moment was at the peak of its terrifying confidence. These were men who believed in glory through battle, men who believed that dying bravely with weapons in hand could open the way to honour in the next world. They had beaten enough enemies to believe that very few powers could stop them, and so, sometime in 844 AD, a large Norse fleet, Arabic sources would describe up to 80 ships, with warrior numbers that are difficult to verify and probably exaggerated in later retellings, set sail from bases along the French coast and turned their dragon prows southward. They struck Asturias first in northern Christian Spain, though the Christian king Ramiro I bloodied them badly at a Coruna near the Tower of Hercules. Undeterred, they sailed on. They reached the Umayyad-held town of Lisbon in August of 844, then under Muslim control, occupied it for 13 days, and fought off several attempts to dislodge them. Then they continued south, raiding Cadiz, Medina Sidonia, and Algeciras as they went. By September of 844 AD, the Viking fleet had reached the wide, muddy mouth of the Guadalquivir River, and that was when they understood the scale of what lay before them. The Guadalquivir, the river the Romans had called the Baetis, flowed straight into the heart of Al-Andalus, and at its heart sat Seville, Isbilia in Arabic, one of the richest, most sophisticated cities in the entire medieval world. The Emirate of Cordoba, the Umayyad Emirate that controlled most of what is today Spain and Portugal, was in 844 AD a civilization entering its golden age. Its capital, Cordoba, was already among the largest cities in Western Europe, perhaps home to well over 100,000 people in the 9th century, with later caliphal Cordoba growing still larger in legend and memory. Seville itself was a great commercial hub, a city of mosques and markets, of scholars and merchants. The Muslim chroniclers describe it as a place of beauty and wealth, almost beyond description. To a raiding fleet looking for plunder, it must have looked like treasure. But the emirate was not without teeth. Emir Abd al-Rahman II, who had ruled since 822 AD, was no passive administrator. He had spent decades managing a complex, often fractious state, suppressing internal rebellions, conducting diplomatic correspondence with Byzantium and the Carolingians, and building Cordoba into the cultural powerhouse it had become. He was intelligent, methodical, and, when the situation demanded it, utterly ruthless. The news of the Viking advance must have reached Cordoba like a thunderclap, and what followed, the military mobilization, the strategic patience, and finally the devastating counterattack, would prove to the entire medieval world that the Umayyad Emirate was not a civilization that could be plundered and forgotten. In 4 acts, we're going to move through the surviving story as closely and cinematically as the sources allow. From the first longship that appeared on the Guadalquivir to the final warning, displayed after the battle, this is the Battle of Tablada, and it is time you knew the truth. They came from a world of ice and iron. Long before the first longship appeared on the Guadalquivir, the Vikings had already rewritten the rules of medieval warfare. They were not just raiders, they were a force of nature, a storm with axes. Born from the fjords and frozen coasts of Scandinavia, these warriors had by the early 9th century spread fear across many coasts and rivers of northwestern Europe. England bled, Ireland burned, and Francia, the once mighty empire of Charlemagne, was learning that even imperial frontiers could be pierced by ships that appeared without warning. What made the Vikings so feared was not merely their ferocity, it was their speed. Their longships were engineering miracles, shallow-drafted, clinker-built vessels of oak and pine that could cross the open Atlantic and then pivot without warning and sail 20 miles up a river. No city was safe because of geography alone. Distance was no defence. Every coast, every estuary, every river mouth was a doorway. And the Vikings had the keys to all of them. To truly understand the terror these men carried with them, you need to picture a Viking longship up close. Not as the romanticised wood carvings in a museum, but as a weapon. A typical longship of this era, a draka as the Norse called the largest class, measured between 25 and 30 metres in length. Narrow, with a beam of only 4 to 5 metres, built for pure speed and manoeuvrability. The keel was laid from a single massive oak trunk, shaped and seasoned over years. The hull was built with overlapping clinker planks, each one flexible enough to absorb the force of ocean swells rather than crack against them. The sail was of heavy wool, dyed red and white in alternating stripes, and at the prow, carved from a single block of timber, the dragon head, rising 5 feet above the waterline painted in black and red, designed not just as decoration, but as a psychological weapon, as a statement of intent. When that prow broke through river mist at dawn, the message was instant and unmistakable. Death has come, and there is nowhere to run. The Viking warriors who crewed these ships were, by the standards of the 9th century, among the most physically formidable and battle-experienced fighters in the world. They were not the fur-clad barbarians of later legend. The Norse warrior of 844 AD was equipped with real military sophistication: iron helmets, conical, with welded nasal guards, mail coats, where the warrior's wealth permitted, or thick leather-padded armour for those of lesser means, broad round shields of lime wood, fitted with iron bosses, painted in vivid geometric patterns, and the weapons, the long-hafted axe, which could split a shield or helmet with terrifying force, the broad-bladed spear for thrusting, the scramus axe, a heavy single-edged knife worn at the hip, and for the wealthiest and most prestigious warriors, the straight double-edged sword sometimes passed down through generations and given a name. These men had been training since childhood. Norse society was organised around the expectation of war. Boys learned to row before they could read. They practised with wooden weapons in the farmyard and graduated to iron in their early teens. The Jarl, the warlord chieftain, was the centre of a social gravity that pulled the most capable young men toward him, offering treasure, reputation, and the stories that the schools would sing. A Viking warrior's entire social identity was built upon what he had done in battle and at sea. In the elite poetic tradition of the Norse world, the warrior who died bravely in battle could be imagined among the honoured dead in Valhalla, the hall of Odin. Fear of death was not absent. It was simply challenged by another fear, the fear of living and dying without a story worth singing about. By 844 AD, the Norse raiding world was filled with confidence. A generation of warriors had grown up hearing story after story of successful raids. They had watched Christian kings crumble. They had looted abbeys and cathedrals. They had burned Rouen in 841 AD. They had sacked Nantes on the feast day of St. John the Baptist in 843 AD. And later, chronicles say Bishop Gunhard, also rendered Gohard, was killed at the altar as the city was plundered. They had sailed up the Garonne and raided deep into Aquitaine. To the Norse mind, the south must have beckoned like an open wound, warm, wealthy, and undefended. A world ripe for the taking by men who had already taken so much. The fleet that turned its prows toward Iberia in the summer of 844 AD was, by any standard of the age, a formidable force. Arab chronicles would later describe it as numbering between 54 and 80 longships. While precise numbers vary between sources, even the lower estimate puts the warrior count in the hundreds, possibly exceeding 1,000 battle-hardened men. The surviving Arabic accounts, however, do not name the commanders of the 844 raid. Later Viking traditions and later Mediterranean expeditions are sometimes associated with famous names such as Bjorn Ironside and Hestin. But for this specific attack, the safest historical statement is simpler and colder. Whoever led the fleet remains unknown. That unknown commander matters for the tone of the story. It means this is not a saga built around one legendary name. It is a clash between systems. The mobile violence of the Viking raiding world and the organised power of Umayyad al-Andalus. One side trusted speed, surprise, ships, fear, and the shock of sudden violence. The other side, once awakened, trusted administration, cavalry, local intelligence, fortified places, and the ability to assemble a coalition under central command. That is why the story feels larger than a single battle. It is not just a duel between commanders, it is a collision between two ways of making war. They struck the coast of northern Spain first, the Christian kingdom of Asturias. Near the ancient Tower of Hercules at A Coruña, they tested the defences and found them stiffer than expected. King Ramiro I of Asturias gathered his forces quickly and bloodied the fleet in a sharp engagement near the coast. The Vikings were not stopped, but they were reminded that they were not unopposed. They pulled back to sea, raided the countryside as they went, and turned south, following the Iberian coastline with cold, calculating purpose. What is historically significant about the stop in Asturias is not just the skirmish with Ramiro I, it is what the Vikings learned from it. They observed that the Christian kingdoms of northern Iberia, while capable of resistance, were small, fragmented, and largely rural. Poor prizes compared to what their intelligence and their instincts told them lay further south. They had almost certainly encountered Muslim merchants in Francia, and possibly in Lisbon. They knew of Al-Andalus, they knew it was wealthy, and the relative ease with which they then proceeded to sack Lisbon, holding it for 13 days against the garrison of the Umayyad Emirate, fighting off several attempts to dislodge them, confirmed what they suspected. The south was rich, and it was reachable. Lisbon fell quickly. The Arabic sources describe the Viking attack on the city, then a secondary administrative centre of the Umayyad Emirate, as sudden, brutal, and overwhelming. The garrison was caught unprepared. The Norse warriors beached their ships, stormed the lower town, and established a fortified perimeter before the Muslim defenders could organise an effective response. They held the city for 13 days, long enough to strip it of portable wealth and rest their crews, before the approach of a relief force from the interior prompted them to re-embark. They had not been beaten. They had simply finished what they came to do and moved on. Cadiz fell. Medina Sidonia was struck. Algeciras was raided. These were not the hesitant probes of men unsure of their targets. This was a systematic pillage, a reconnaissance in force, moving deeper and deeper into the heart of a civilization they were only beginning to understand. The Guadalquivir River was the key. Any navigator sailing up the southwest coast of Iberia and looking at the geography would understand it immediately. The great river was not just a waterway. It was a highway into the interior, broad, navigable for well over 100 kilometres, leading directly to the wealthiest cities in the entire western Mediterranean world. The Arabic geographers had for decades written about the Guadalquivir with pride. It was, they said, the river of life for Al-Andalus, the artery through which the wealth of the empire flowed. The Vikings, who had spent decades identifying and exploiting exactly these kinds of arterial waterways across northern Europe, understood what that meant the moment they reached its mouth. And then, on the morning of Thursday, September 25th, 844 AD, the fleet made its move and entered the wide brown mouth of the Guadalquivir River. Imagine being a fisherman on the riverbank that morning. The autumn mist is still thick over the water. The reeds are gold and brown. And out of that mist, one by one, emerge the dragon prows. 54 longships, square red and white sails furled now, oars churning the dark water in perfect rhythm, silent, purposeful, inevitable. The sound would have reached the banks first, the rhythmic creak of oarlocks, the soft splash of hundreds of oars moving in unison, the low, almost subsonic rumble of a fleet in motion, and then the shapes, growing out of the mist like nightmares made solid, coming upriver, coming for everything. The alarms spread through the city like wildfire. Messengers on horseback pounded toward the governor's palace. Men grabbed what they could and fled into the surrounding countryside. Women gathered children. The wealthy loaded mules with silver and bolted for the gates. The governor of Seville, facing a threat unlike anything in the city's recent memory, made a calculation that later sources portray as catastrophic. He fled. He did not organise the defence. He did not rally the city's garrison. He simply left. And when the man responsible for the city's safety runs, the city itself runs with him. For the inhabitants who remained, there was no organised defence, no coordinated resistance, no professional army waiting behind the walls. The Viking warriors beached their ships on the sandbars of the Isla Menor, the small island in the Guadalquivir just south of the city, and used it as a fortified base of operations. The island was a brilliant tactical choice, as it would prove to be, surrounded by water on all sides, accessible by ship, and close enough to Seville to permit rapid assault, while remaining difficult to attack directly from the city itself. From there, they launched their assault on the city's outskirts within days of arrival. By October 1st, 844 AD, just 6 days after their appearance on the river, the outer districts of Seville were in Norse hands. What followed was, by any measure, a catastrophe. For 7 days, according to the Arabic sources, the Vikings engaged in systematic, brutal occupation. They did not simply loot and leave. They looted, burned, enslaved, and stayed. Houses were stripped bare. Markets were emptied. Mosques were desecrated. Arab chroniclers describe men being cut down in the streets, women and children taken captive by the hundreds, and the once magnificent city reduced to a bleeding, hollowed shell. The Great Mosque, one of the most beautiful in all of Al-Andalus, was converted into a stable and a slaughterhouse for livestock. They attempted to set it on fire, though they were eventually prevented from doing so. Muslim writers interpreted this failure as divine protection. The truth, perhaps, is simply that some things burn more slowly than others. What is certain is that the desecration of the mosque was a deliberate act, not of ignorance, but of contempt, of dominance, a statement written in smoke and horse dung on the most sacred floor in the city. The prisoners were a particularly grim chapter. Arabic sources describe the systematic seizure of Seville's population for ransom and enslavement. The Norse slave trade was one of the most economically significant aspects of the Viking world. Slaves captured in Ireland, England and Francia had for generations been transported to markets in Scandinavia and Russia, traded for silver, furs and amber. The Vikings almost certainly intended the captives from Seville to meet the same fate. Some were held at the island camp as leverage for ransom negotiations with local authorities. Others were earmarked for transport north. The Arabic chronicles record the grief and terror of the families separated in those October days with a vividness that still carries its full weight of sorrow across 12 centuries. The only resistance came from a small defending force that had barricaded itself inside the Alcazar, the fortified citadel, and refused to surrender. These were not professional soldiers for the most part. They were a mixture of city guards, retired military men, and ordinary citizens who had decided that the walls of the Alcazar were preferable to whatever fate awaited them outside. They sent desperate messages south, toward Cordoba, toward the Emir. They held, they waited, they prayed, and in their stubborn refusal to capitulate, they preserved something more than their own lives. They preserved the idea that Seville had not entirely fallen, that the city still had a pulse, however faint, however desperate. Outside the walls, the Vikings were not resting on their laurels. Expeditionary war parties fanned out into the surrounding countryside with ruthless efficiency, one column pushing south toward Moron, another reportedly probing the roads toward Cordoba itself, roughly 75 miles to the east-northeast. Some raiding parties struck deep into the fertile valley farms of the Guadalquivir plain, seizing cattle and grain and more prisoners. Others set fire to outlying villages as tactical demonstrations, not simply out of cruelty, but to spread panic, to keep the surrounding population from organizing any kind of resistance, to ensure that the Emir in Cordoba could not draw on local levies for an immediate counterattack. These were not panicked men. These were professionals who had done this before, in England, in France, in Ireland. They established a disciplined camp on the al-Rahman with watch rotations and supply logistics. They took hostages. They levied tribute from nearby settlements. They operated, in short, like the well-organized military force that they were, and therein lay the seed of their destruction. In their mastery of terror and in the confidence built by years of successful raiding, the Vikings made the oldest mistake in military history. They assumed that what had worked everywhere else would work here. They raided one column too many. They stayed 1 week too long. They misread their enemy, not as cowards, not as disorganized Christians fleeing in prayer, but as what they truly were, the armed servants of one of the most sophisticated military states in the medieval world, a state that was, at this very moment, waking up, a state that was counting its horses, sharpening its swords, and marching toward the Guadalquivir with cold professional fury. The Vikings had taken Seville, but they had not yet met Abd al-Rahman II. Roughly 75 miles east-northeast of Seville, behind the walls of Cordoba, Abd al-Rahman II received the news. We do not know exactly how the messenger arrived, whether he rode through the night, clothes torn and face white with dust, or whether the word came in a formal written dispatch, sealed and handed to the chamberlain with trembling hands. What we do know from the Arabic chronicles is that the news was devastating. The governor of Seville had fled. The city was in Norse hands. The invaders had established a fortified camp. They were raiding into the countryside, and they were showing no signs of leaving. Most rulers of the era, upon receiving such news, would have done one of three things. They would have prayed, they would have panicked, or they would have offered to negotiate, perhaps sent a treasury official with silver to buy the invaders' departure, as the Franks so often did. Abd al-Rahman II did none of these things. He did something far more dangerous. He thought. To understand what happened next, you must understand who this man truly was. Born on the 1st of November, 792 AD, Abd al-Rahman II was the fourth Umayyad Emir of Cordoba, a ruler who had already been on the throne for 22 years by the time the Viking ships appeared on his river. 22 years of almost continuous warfare. He had fought the Christian kingdom of Asturias on the northern frontier in battle after battle, halting the southward advance of King Alfonso II and pushing the frontier line firm. He had suppressed a major uprising in Toledo in 837 AD, one of the most dangerous urban rebellions of his reign. He had crushed it. He had managed complex diplomacy with the Byzantine Empire to the east and the Carolingian kingdoms to the north. He had, in short, spent his entire adult life solving problems that would have broken lesser men. Understanding the Umayyad dynasty itself is essential here, because Abd al-Rahman II was not simply a strong individual born into a weak institution. He was the culmination of a dynasty that had been forged in one of the most dramatic survival stories in all of medieval history. The original Umayyad Caliphate, based in Damascus, had been overthrown in 750 AD by the Abbasid Revolution, a brutal coup that massacred virtually the entire Umayyad royal family at a banquet that was supposedly a peace meeting. Nearly every Umayyad prince was killed. One man survived. Abd al-Rahman I, later known as the Falcon of the Quraysh, fled across North Africa, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar with a handful of companions, and within 6 years had carved out an independent emirate in Iberia through a combination of military genius and ruthless political intelligence. He had built something from nothing. His descendants had spent 3 generations making that something into one of the strongest states in the Western Mediterranean. By the time Abd al-Rahman II sat on the throne in Cordoba, he was the custodian of a legacy built on survival, on defiance, and on an absolute refusal to be destroyed by enemies who thought him easy prey. The Vikings were walking into a story they did not know, and its ending was already written in Umayyad blood and iron. But Abd al-Rahman II was not only a warrior. That is what makes him so extraordinary, and so different from the Norse chieftains who are even now dividing the plunder of his cities. He was also a ruler of immense cultural ambition. His court welcomed the famous musician and courtier Abd, who came from the Eastern Islamic world and became one of the defining cultural figures of 9th century Cordoba. Later tradition credits Abd with shaping music, etiquette, fashion, grooming, dining customs, and even with adding a 5th string to the lute. Some of those details are difficult to separate from later legend, and a careful script should not present every colourful tradition as a documented fact. But the central point is secure. Abd al-Rahman II's court was not a crude frontier court. It was a place of poetry, music, law, administration, patronage, and elite refinement. That distinction matters. The Vikings were not attacking an isolated town ruled by a frightened local lord. They were attacking a connected Umayyad state with a capital that was already drawing scholars, officials, soldiers, musicians, craftsmen, merchants, and diplomats into its orbit. Cordoba in Abd al-Rahman II's day was not yet the fully developed 10th century caliphal, metropolis of later legend, but it was already becoming the rising Umayyad capital of the Western Mediterranean. Its strength was not only in its walls or its cavalry, it was in administration, communication, tax collection, patronage, law, and the ability to turn a crisis in one city into a coordinated response from the whole state. That is the difference between a wealthy target and a dangerous enemy. The Vikings understood the first part. They were about to learn the second. This was the man the Vikings had chosen to provoke, and it is crucial to understand why that choice, made in ignorance, made in the blind confidence of men who had never faced a truly organized state, was catastrophic. Because Abd al-Rahman II did not merely command an army. He commanded a military machine of extraordinary sophistication, one that drew on centuries of inherited Umayyad knowledge and had been honed by decades of active frontier warfare. The Umayyad military tradition in Al-Andalus was not simply a transplant of Arabian desert tactics dropped onto Iberian soil. It was a living, evolving system that had absorbed and integrated the lessons of fighting on multiple frontiers simultaneously. The Christian kingdoms of the north, the Frankish Empire across the Pyrenees, the Berber tribal confederacies of North Africa, and the internal conflicts of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state that was always, at some level, managing its own contradictions. The emir's army knew how to fight in mountains and on plains, in city streets and in river valleys. It knew how to conduct sieges and how to break them. It knew logistics, the science of feeding, supplying, and moving an army across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain without losing cohesion. The Vikings, for all their ferocity, had nothing like this. They were raiders. Brilliant, terrifying raiders, but raiders nonetheless. The Umayyad army of al-Andalus in 844 AD was a multi-ethnic force built from several military traditions. At its core were the Yund, military settler communities and regimental traditions rooted in the Arab and Syrian forces that had entered Iberia in the early 8th century. These groups were organised by regional origin and local settlement, and they remained an important part of Andalusian military life. Around this core fought Berber cavalry, local levies, household troops, client soldiers, and muwallads, Iberian converts to Islam who brought intimate knowledge of the landscape, the rivers, and the roads of their homeland. It was not a simple tribal host. It was a state army shaped by administration, frontier pressure, and decades of practical war. That mixture gave the emirate flexibility. The frontier troops understood fast campaigning. Local forces understood roads, villages, crossings, and supply points. Court commanders understood orders, reports, punishments, and rewards. Cavalry could move quickly from one threatened district to another, while infantry and local levies could hold roads, protect towns, and prevent smaller raiding parties from spreading without resistance. This was exactly the kind of layered response that raiders hate. A raider wants panic, delay, and isolation. He wants each town to feel alone. Abd al-Rahman II's response did the opposite. It turned the Viking raid from a series of local disasters into a single strategic problem, and then brought the resources of the state to bear against it. What the Umayyad forces had, above all else, was cavalry. Fast, disciplined, coordinated cavalry. This was the arm that would matter at Tablada, and Abd al-Rahman II had spent his entire reign developing it. The horses of Al-Andalus, bred from Arab bloodlines brought across from North Africa, were among the finest war horses in the world. Fast, spirited, and exquisitely responsive to their riders, they had been selectively bred for centuries in the traditions of the Arabian Peninsula, where the horse was not merely a tool of war but a sacred trust. In open terrain, against an infantry-based enemy relying on mass and shock to win engagements, these horsemen were not just an advantage, they were a death sentence. But cavalry alone does not win battles against a determined, disciplined enemy. What wins battles is cavalry combined with coordination, with the ability to control the tempo of an engagement, to strike where the enemy is weak, to deny the enemy the kind of fight they want and impose the kind of fight they cannot survive. This is what the Andalusian commanders had spent years learning, and this is what they would demonstrate at Tablada. The emir also had something the Vikings could not have anticipated: engineers. The military tradition of the Umayyads drew on a rich heritage of siege and field engineering inherited from both the Byzantine and Sassanid worlds, a tradition that included the use of incendiary compounds, naphtha, liquid fire. The Umayyads had encountered Byzantine Greek fire during the great naval campaigns of the early caliphate, and the knowledge of incendiary warfare had been carefully preserved and developed in the Islamic military tradition. Engineers in Al-Andalus knew how to manufacture, store, and deploy naphtha, how to pack it into ceramic vessels, how to arm catapults with it, how to project it in burning arcs onto enemy formations and, crucially, onto wooden ships. When Abd al-Rahman II began to organise his response, he was not simply sending men with swords, he was deploying a system that had an answer for every weapon the Vikings carried. Abd al-Rahman II's immediate response was characteristically precise and methodical. He sent urgent dispatches, carried by the Emirates' relay courier system, the fastest means of communication in the Western Mediterranean world, to the military governors of the surrounding provinces, calling for reinforcement and the immediate mobilization of all available cavalry. Cavalry units from the frontier zones, battle-hardened men who had spent years fighting Christian knights on the northern border, men who knew how to ride hard and fight fast and maintain cohesion under pressure, began their march south towards Seville within days. Simultaneously, local forces were organised and deployed to prevent the Viking raiding columns from probing deeper into Al-Andalus. The emir's trusted administrator and field commander was Isa ibn Shuhaid, a powerful court figure whose authority extended far beyond ceremonial palace duties. This was no mere functionary. Isa ibn Shuhaid was a proven military administrator who had served the emir through multiple crises, a man of both organisational intelligence and personal courage. It was to him that Abd al-Rahman entrusted the execution of what would become a brilliantly conceived campaign of encirclement and destruction. There was also a remarkable dimension to the political mobilisation that the Arabic sources record. The threat of the Magus, the Norse pagans from the north, had the effect of temporarily unifying forces within Al-Andalus that were normally fractious and competitive. Among the commanders who brought forces to bear against the Vikings was Musa ibn Musa al-Kasi, the semi-autonomous ruler of the Banu Kasi dynasty in the upper Ebro Valley, a man of mixed Arab and Visigothic descent who had spent much of his career playing the Umayyad Emirate and the Christian kingdoms of the north against each other for his own advantage. He was by any measure not a loyal subject of Abd al-Rahman II, he was a political survivor. Yet when the Viking fleet appeared on the Guadalquivir, Musa ibn Musa joined the Andalusian coalition with his soldiers. The threat was that severe. The need for unified response was that obvious. Even the most cynical political operator in Al-Andalus understood that a Viking conquest of Seville was not an outcome that served anyone's interests, including his own. But there was a complication, and it is one that the Arabic sources describe with a kind of grim frankness that modern historians have found striking. While the emir was mobilising his forces with speed and purpose, the Vikings were not sitting still. Emboldened by the fall of Seville, and apparently unaware of the storm gathering against them, Norse raiding parties had fanned out across the countryside around the city and were pushing their reach ever wider. One column reportedly attacked and sacked the town of Moron south of Seville, stripping it of grain and livestock and burning its defences. Others pushed toward the approaches of Cordoba itself, probing roads and testing defences with the casual arrogance of men who had never been turned around. The Arabic chronicles record a particularly grim episode in which a raiding party reached the outskirts of the town of Carmona, roughly 50 miles from Cordoba and only about 20 miles from Seville, before being driven back by a scratch force of local defenders. The message this sent to Cordoba was unmistakable. The threat was not contained. It was growing. The local population responded with a courage that the chronicles record with unmistakable pride. Arab accounts describe ordinary men, farmers, townspeople, retired soldiers, religious scholars who took up arms for the first time in their lives, organising into makeshift defensive forces to resist the raiding parties. They built barricades on road approaches. They organised bucket brigades to extinguish fires started by Norse scouts. They ambushed smaller Viking patrols in olive groves and river crossings. They did not always win. Norse warriors with iron helmets and axes were simply better trained for individual combat than most of the men who faced them. But they fought, and every clash, every delay imposed on the Norse columns was buying time. Time for Isa ibn Shuhaid, time for the cavalry to arrive from the frontier, time for the catapults to be assembled on the warships moving down toward the river mouth, time for the trap to be set. Because Abd al-Rahman II had understood something fundamental about his enemy in a remarkably short time. The Vikings were brilliant at assault. They were terrifying in open melee. Their shield wall, the famous Skjaldborg, a tight line of interlocking shields with spears thrusting from behind and axes ready to swing, was a weapon of devastating power against infantry. It had broken Frankish armies. It had smashed through the gates of English monasteries. It was, in virtually every theatre of European warfare, brutally effective when opponents gave the Norse the close fight they wanted. But it had a critical prerequisite. The Vikings had to be able to choose the ground and set the terms of engagement. They had to fight where they wanted to fight, when they wanted to fight, against an enemy that came straight at them. Remove that prerequisite, and even a strong shield wall became more vulnerable. And so, Abd al-Rahman II decided, with cold clarity, not to fight them in a straight line. The sources do not preserve a minute-by-minute tactical plan, so the following battlefield logic must be treated as a cautious reconstruction. What is clear is that the Andalusian forces gathered, fought a series of engagements, chose ground near Tablada, used fire against the ships, and inflicted a decisive defeat. That caveat does not weaken the drama, it strengthens it. A responsible historical script should not pretend that a 9th century chronicler left us a modern battlefield map with arrows, timestamps, and unit names. What we can do is take the firm points: the Viking camp, the Andalusian mobilization, the fighting near Tablada, the burning ships, the heavy Viking losses, and the aftermath, and build the most cautious battlefield reconstruction around them. The result is still terrifying because the outcome is not in doubt. However the exact maneuvers unfolded, the raiders were drawn into a fight they could not control. The strategy that seems to have emerged from the Emir's Council of War was elegant in its conception. The Andalusian army would not storm Seville and fight the Vikings in the city's narrow streets, where cavalry was useless, and Norse axes could kill as easily in an alley as on a battlefield. Nor would they allow the Vikings to keep the initiative, to keep raiding, keep looting, and eventually depart laden with plunder to return the following year with twice the ships. Instead, the Andalusian forces would maneuver. They would draw the Viking force out of their fortified camp on the Isla Menor. They would choose the ground. They would control the tempo. And then, on open terrain, on ground that favoured horses over shields, movement over mass, they would destroy them. Not wound them, not repel them, destroy them. Make of this raid an example so total, so absolute, that the name Tablada would carry across every sea and fjord in the Norse world as a warning. The location chosen for this destruction was a flat, wide stretch of land south of Seville, near the village of Tablada, the plain of Tablada. It was ideal cavalry country, open, unobstructed, with the Guadalquivir at its edge to eliminate the possibility of Viking retreat to their ships by a simple sideways march. The Emir's commanders would use everything: cavalry charges from multiple directions, feigned retreats to stretch and break the Norse formation, archers to exhaust shields and arms, and, as a final devastating stroke delivered, simultaneously on the river, fire. Through October of 844 AD, the Andalusian forces gathered. Province by province, regiment by regiment, the army assembled south of Seville, hidden in the hills and valleys of the Axaraf Ridge and the surrounding countryside out of Norse sight lines, moving only at night or in small groups to avoid detection. Scouts maintained constant observation of the Isla Menor camp, reporting on Viking troop movements, foraging patterns, and guard rotations. The intelligence picture that Isa ibn Shuhayd assembled over these weeks must have been far clearer than anything the Vikings expected. Simultaneously, the Andalusian warships on the lower Guadalquivir were being armed. Engineers loaded naphtha vessels into catapult housings. Rowers trained for combat formation on the river. The trap was being baited from both land and water simultaneously, with a precision the Vikings could not have imagined was being directed against them. The Vikings, meanwhile, remained on the Isla Menor. Their camp was well organised, defensible, and stocked with plunder. But it was also an island, and islands, no matter how well fortified, have a critical weakness. They are surrounded by water, and water can be controlled by those who own it. The Andalusian commanders had noted this, carefully. By early November 844 AD, the trap was ready. All that remained was to spring it. The method of alluring the Viking force out into the open is not described in forensic detail in the surviving sources, but the strategic logic is clear. The Andalusian forces made themselves visible, a show of strength on the approaches to Seville, a military presence that could not be ignored. For the Vikings, the calculus was straightforward: fight or sail. And since sailing would mean abandoning the plunder, the captives, and the prestige they had staked their entire raid upon, since retreat in the face of an enemy they had never once respected was not, culturally, a real option. They did what the Emir had known they would do. They came out to fight, and Abd al-Rahman II was waiting. Before we get to the battle itself, I want to take just 60 seconds to talk to you directly. Not about history, but about this channel and how you can support it. Making videos like this one takes weeks of research, writing, and editing. I do not have a corporate sponsor handing me a check. What I have is you, and there is one thing you can do right now that costs you almost nothing, but genuinely helps keep this channel alive, and it protects you at the same time. Get yourself NordVPN. I use it personally. When I am researching obscure historical sources at midnight, when I am accessing archives in other countries, when I am just trying to browse without my data being harvested, NordVPN is running in the background. It is fast, it is reliable, it protects your connection on public Wi-Fi, and it gives you access to content from anywhere in the world. If you go to the link in the description below and use the code in the pinned comment, you will get a great deal on a plan that supports your privacy, and a small portion goes toward keeping this channel alive and producing the history content you came here for. No pressure. But if you were already thinking about a VPN, now is a great time. The link is below. Thank you. Genuinely. Now. Let's go to Tablada, November, 844 AD, the plain of Tablada. The morning mist over the Guadalquivir hangs low and cold. The river is dark, the colour of iron, and the reeds on its banks are brittle with the first chill of autumn. To the south of Seville, on a wide, flat stretch of earth, the Andalusian army is already in position. They have been moving through the night, cavalry in long columns, infantry in tighter formations, archers with full quivers, and behind them, on the river itself, the warships with their terrible cargo. But we will get to that. For now, the trap is set. All that remains is the prey. By the time the decisive battle came, the Vikings had been in the region for about 6 weeks. Weeks of raiding, burning, taking captives and looting. Weeks of seeming impunity. They had grown confident in the rhythm of it. Go out, strike, return to the al-Rahman loaded with plunder, rest, repeat. The Andalusian forces had been probing at them for weeks. Skirmishes, harassing actions, nothing conclusive. In one engagement, the forces of Musa ibn Musa al-Qasi, the semi-autonomous ruler of the Banu Qasi principality in the north, who had brought his own soldiers south in a rare alignment of interests against the Norse invaders, had reportedly helped inflict a sharp defeat on a Viking raiding column. One tradition gives 70 Viking losses. 70. The Vikings had lost men to ambushes before, but 70 in a single engagement was a different kind of message. A message that said, this place is not the same as the others, and still they stayed. Still they held the Islamic. Still they trusted in the superiority they had earned through a decade of victories. To understand why they finally came out, why they abandoned the defensive advantage of their island camp and marched onto the killing ground of Tablada, you have to understand not just the Viking mind, but the specific pressures building on the Norse chieftains by early November. About 6 weeks was a long time to maintain a raiding force in a hostile territory without reliable resupply. The provisions taken from Seville and the surrounding countryside were finite. The horses that the Andalusian cavalry kept showing on the road, approaches to the city could not be ignored indefinitely without risking encirclement. And perhaps most importantly, the objective of the raid was deteriorating by the day. Every week they stayed without delivering a decisive victory was a week in which the accumulated plunder was being consumed by the logistics of maintaining the camp, and in which the growing Andalusian military presence made the eventual evacuation more dangerous, not less. The Viking chieftains faced a military commander's most basic dilemma: fight now, on terms that are becoming less favourable each day you wait, or retreat and lose everything. And retreat was hard to accept for men whose honour culture praised courage, reputation, and loyalty to the warband. When the Andalusian army made itself fully visible on the approaches to Seville, when Isa ibn Shuhaid's cavalry appeared in force on the plains south of the city, clearly offering battle, the Viking decision was made in moments. The shield wall formed, the axes were raised, the Norse formation began to move. Picture the Viking formation moving off the Islamic and onto the southern plain. These were the same hard, professional warriors we met earlier, veterans of river raids, coastal assaults, and close-quarter violence across Francia and the Atlantic world. Now, their equipment mattered less than their discipline. They moved in tight formation, shield rims overlapping, a wall of wood and iron that had broken armies, cracked open city gates, and absorbed cavalry pressure without flinching. The Skjaldborg, the shield wall, the Viking battle formation that had made them effectively unstoppable for a generation. In a straight-line engagement on level ground, it was devastating. The front rank locked shields, braced legs, and presented a near impenetrable face of iron and wood to the enemy. Those behind thrust spears over the shoulders of the front rank. The back ranks pressed forward, keeping the formation dense, keeping pressure on the line. The wall moved as one organism. It breathed as one. It bled as one. Breaking it from the front required extreme bravery and enormous numerical superiority. Many enemies had struggled to answer it in a direct engagement. But before the battle lines even made contact, the Andalusian strategy began to reveal itself. The cavalry did not wait at the far end of the plain and invite a direct approach. They moved. From the moment the Viking formation left the Islamic and began crossing the flat ground toward the Andalusian position, the horsemen were already in motion, not toward the Norse line, but around it. Detachments split off left and right, using the speed of their horses to position themselves on the flanks of the advancing shield wall before it could adjust. Archers, both mounted and on foot, positioned along the edges of the plain, began to loose immediately. The arrows were not aimed to kill through the shields, though some found gaps. They were aimed to exhaust. Every minute that a Norse warrior held his shield at shoulder height against an incoming arrow was a minute that drained the muscles of his shield arm. An hour of that and even the strongest man begins to slow, and a slow shield wall is a dying shield wall. The initial phase of the land battle is best understood as a deliberate suffocation. The Andalusian cavalry refused to give the Norse formation the straight-line clash it needed. They swept forward on the flanks, launched short volleys of javelins, and wheeled away before the Norse could surge forward to engage them. This was the Kar-Wafar, the strike and retreat, the classic Arab cavalry tactic that had been developed over centuries of desert warfare and refined in the decades of frontier fighting in Al-Andalus. It was maddening to face. The Norse warriors, trained for the moment of bodily contact, for the crash of shield on shield, the grunt and press of bodies, the short lethal work of the axe in close quarters, had no answer for an enemy that would not stand still. Advance, and the horsemen pulled back. Stand, and the arrows kept coming. Reform and the horsemen swept back in from a different angle. The Vikings began to advance. This was precisely what the Andalusian commanders wanted. As the Norse formation moved forward, maintaining cohesion, shields up, the front rank watching the horsemen with axes ready, the Andalusian cavalry refused to stand still. They struck one flank, wheeled, struck the other, wheeled again. Archers loosed from horseback and from fixed positions at the edges of the plain, forcing the Viking formation to keep shields raised, exhausting arms and narrowing vision. The Skjaldborg was designed to stop a direct charge. Against this swirling, multi-directional pressure, it became something different. A slow-moving target, bleeding at the edges, thinning in the flanks, its rear becoming exposed as the advance pulled the formation's tail away from the Guadalquivir bank and out into the open ground the Andalusian commanders had chosen. And now comes the critical moment. The moment that decided the battle. The moment that ended the myth of Viking invincibility in Al-Andalus. The Norse leadership, seeing the formation harassed and probed from multiple directions, seeing its flanks threatened, wanting to force the decisive engagement that would resolve the stalemate, made the tactical decision that the Andalusian plan had been designed to provoke. The formation's centre pushed forward aggressively. The shield wall lurched into a more pronounced advance, trying to close the distance with the Andalusian infantry positions that Isa ibn Shuhayd had positioned as bait in the centre of the plain. It was the right instinct in virtually any other engagement. Drive forward, close with the enemy, force the melee. It had worked 100 times. It would not work today. And then the order was given. The cavalry converged from multiple directions simultaneously. Not a direct frontal charge into the shield line. That would have played directly into what the Norse were trained to destroy. Instead, the attack came from the flanks and the rear. The Berber horsemen, light and terrifyingly fast, hit the Norse formation on its left side with a coordinated charge that was not a single wave but a rolling echeloned series of strikes. One unit hitting and wheeling, the next unit driving in before the defenders could reform, the third unit striking as the second disengaged. It was like being struck by a fist made of water, shapeless, relentless, impossible to block because it had no fixed shape. A second cavalry force struck the right flank with equal ferocity, and a third Andalusian element, infantry supported by cavalry lancers, pressed directly forward against the now stretched front rank of the shield wall. The formation that had been a wall was now a box. and the box was being compressed from 3 sides simultaneously. The shield wall, that magnificent fighting machine, is designed with one unforgivable assumption built into it, that the enemy will attack from the front, that the violence will arrive in a predictable direction, and that the interlocked shields will face it, absorb it, and let the axes do their work. When 3 forces strike simultaneously from 3 directions, when the men on the far left of the formation are fighting cavalry, bearing down from the west, while the men on the far right are holding a different cavalry assault from the east, while the front rank is engaged with advancing infantry from the south, the wall no longer has a front. It has only chaos. Every warrior must fight his own battle. The collective discipline that makes the Skjaldborg lethal dissolves into 100 individual combats. And in 100 individual combats against a fresh, well-armed, coordinated opponent, the mathematics are brutal. The Viking line fractured. It did not break all at once. These were too experienced for that, too hard to kill. The Norse front rank held for longer than most armies would have. Individual warriors and small clusters fought on with ferocious, desperate skill. Arabic sources record hard fighting, and later retellings preserve the image of Norse warriors refusing to break even as the battle turned against them. These were not cowards. Let that be said clearly. The men who died on the plain of Tablada were among the most capable warriors of their age. They deserved a better end than being surrounded and cut down on foreign soil for a raid that their leader's arrogance had turned into a death trap. But they were men who'd grown up believing that how you died in battle was the only thing that truly mattered. And so they stood, and they fought, and they were cut down. The moment that sealed the Norse fate on land came when their formation lost cohesion and command. In any medieval battle, the collapse of leadership and formation is not just a military event, it is a psychological catastrophe. A Norse warband depended on trust, shared victories, distributed reward, and loyalty to leaders. Once the centre of that trust failed, the retreat began, not as a coordinated withdrawal, but as a dissolution. Warriors broke away from the shrinking formation and ran for the river. Some made it. Many did not. The Andalusian cavalry pursued with the disciplined ruthlessness of professional soldiers who had been told by their commanders and their emir that this was not to be a partial victory, it was to be an annihilation. On the river, the catastrophe was complete and absolute. As the land battle reached its crisis, the Andalusian warships had already moved into position against the Viking fleet moored at the Islamic. The catapults fired. The first burning projectiles arced across the grey November sky and struck the longships. Naphtha, this liquid, clinging, impossible to extinguish fire, caught on the oak and pine planking and held. Then it spread. Then it leapt from hull to hull where the ships were moored close together, as longships in a river anchorage always were. The sources vary, but the commonly cited high figure says that about 30 Viking ships were destroyed in the assault on the fleet. 30 longships. Think about what it took to build 30 longships. The forests stripped of their finest oaks, the months of skilled labour, the iron for the rivets, the wool for the sails, the seasoned timber for the keels. A generation of Scandinavian craftsmanship, a decade of accumulated maritime wealth, the material foundation of the entire raid, reduced to floating ash in an afternoon. The few Vikings who survived the battle on the plain and managed to reach the riverbank found a scene of complete devastation. Their ships were burning, their leaders were dead, captured, or scattered. Their formation was destroyed. Their comrades lay behind them on the plain of Tablada. 500, perhaps more, of the finest warriors the Norse world had produced. And the banks of the Guadalquivir, which they had sailed up 6 weeks earlier in the proud silence of a fleet at war, were now lined with the people they had terrorized. The ordinary men and women and children of Seville and its surrounding villages. And those, people were not silent. Later accounts say the people along the banks hurled stones at the retreating raiders. The men who had seemed supernatural, unstoppable, sent by fate itself to punish the faithful. Those men were running, bleeding, broken. And the people of Seville watched them run with a roar that must have shaken the reeds on the river and rolled across the water like thunder. It was not simply a victory, it was a transformation, of a battle, of a city, of an empire's understanding of what it was capable of when properly organized and properly led. The surviving Vikings, stranded, leaderless, their fleet burning, their army broken, their chieftain dead, did the only thing left to them. They negotiated. They offered to return some of the prisoners they had taken during the raid in exchange for safe passage, food, and clothing to survive the journey home. The Andalusian commanders agreed. The exchange was made. The remaining longships, pathetically few compared to the great fleet that had entered the Guadalquivir 6 weeks before, pulled away from the banks of the river and began the long, wretched journey north. The people of Seville watched them go in silence. The banks of the river were littered with the wreckage of the greatest military humiliation the Norse world had suffered in living memory. Behind them, on the plain of Tablada, the Emir's men were already at work. And what came next, the reckoning, the fire, and the extraordinary historical footnote that no saga ever recorded, is the story of our final act. The battle was over. The reckoning was not. This is the part of the story that the romanticised versions leave out, the part where victory reveals itself not as glory, but as something far older and far darker. Around the traditional date of November 11th, 844 AD, the plain of Tablada was littered with the dead. The Guadalquivir runs dark in the fading afternoon light. Smoke from the burning ship still hazes the sky to the south. And the Emir's army, flushed with a victory that no one in Al-Andalus had dared to believe possible just 6 weeks before, was not finished. The Arabic sources are unusually specific about what came next, and they should be read not as evidence of savagery, but as evidence of political intelligence. Because al-Rahman II was not simply punishing the Vikings for what they had done to Seville, he was sending a message, a carefully composed message, written not in ink but in public spectacle, displayed on the approaches to one of the most recognisable cities in western Iberia. Let us begin with the ships. While the land battle was still raging on the plain of Tablada, the Andalusian warships had already moved to seal the Norse escape route on the river. The catapults mounted on their decks were loaded with ceramic vessels filled with naphtha, the incendiary petroleum compound that the Islamic world had inherited from older Persian and Byzantine military traditions. When these projectiles struck the wooden hulls of the Viking longships moored at the Islamic, the result was devastating. Fire spread among ships that were built from timber, rope, sailcloth, and pitch. The Arabic chronicles give varying figures, but the commonly cited high figure says that about 30 Viking ships were destroyed in the assault on the fleet. Some accounts suggest fewer, others imply the devastation may have been even greater. If the high figure is accepted, 30 longships, each one the product of extraordinary Norse craftsmanship, each one irreplaceable this far from Scandinavia, were gone in the space of an afternoon. The smoke from their burning would have been visible from Cordoba. It would have been visible from the hilltops of the Axarafe Ridge. It would have hung in the sky over the plain of Tablada like a funeral pyre for the myth of Norse invincibility. It is worth pausing on the strategic significance of this, because the destruction of the Viking fleet was not merely a practical military achievement, cutting off retreat, stranding the raiders. It was a declaration. It said to every Norse captain who might be sailing along the Iberian coast and watching the smoke on the horizon, this is what we do here. This is what happens to the ships of those who come for our gold. The Guadalquivir is not the Seine. It is not the Loire. It is not a river you sail up and then sail back down laden with plunder while the people on the banks weep. It is a river from which you do not return. The death toll from the battle and its immediate aftermath was staggering. The Arabic chronicles, cross-referenced by modern historians, place Viking losses at over 500 killed in the battle itself, with total campaign losses, including those killed during the preceding weeks of skirmishing, those who drowned in the river during the retreat, and those executed after capture, potentially running into the thousands. Of those who survived, those who had not been cut down on Tablada, who had not burned with their ships, who had not drowned in the Guadalquivir, many were captured. And for the captured, al-Rahman II had prepared a message that would echo far beyond the walls of Seville. The captured Vikings were executed, and some of the dead were displayed as a warning. The Arabic chronicles are specific enough to make the point clear. The victory was turned into public proof that the threat had been identified, defeated, and punished. Reports say that the heads of the leading raiders were sent to the Emir in Cordoba, while other executed captives were displayed on palm trees near Tablada or Seville. This was a harsh medieval message, but it was also political communication. The city that had been panicking 6 weeks earlier, the city from which the governor had fled, the city whose people had feared what was coming next, could now see that the raiders were no longer untouchable. The palm tree detail became one of the most memorable images in the later accounts of the raid. Those tall icons of the Andalusian landscape had stood near the same roads and river approaches the Norse had used to spread terror. After Tablada, they carried the Emirate's answer. Al-Andalus had not collapsed. It had struck back. In a world without newspapers, radio, photographs, or official press conferences, a ruler communicated victory through visible proof. That proof had to be seen by soldiers, citizens, merchants, rivals, and spies. It had to travel by rumour from Seville to Cordoba, from Cordoba to the frontier, from the frontier to Christian courts, and eventually beyond Iberia itself. This is why the aftermath matters as much as the battle. Abd al-Rahman II needed to restore confidence. Seville had been humiliated. Its governor had fled. Its people had been terrified. A quiet victory, hidden in military reports, would not have been enough. The population had to know that the state had answered. Local commanders had to know that failure would not be tolerated. Future raiders had to know that the Guadalquivir was not an open road. The public warning after Tablada was cruel by modern standards, but in the political language of the 9th century, it was also a statement of restored order. This was not cruelty for its own sake. This was communication at its most primal and effective. Every traveller who saw those palm trees carried the image with them. Every merchant who passed through Seville and then eventually made it to a Norse port or a Frankish market or a Byzantine trading house told the story of what happened at Tablada, the story of what Al-Andalus did to men who came for its gold. The message spread, and it worked. The Vikings would not attempt another significant raid on the heart of Al-Andalus for over a decade. When they returned, and they did return, because the Norse were nothing if not persistent, they were more cautious, more measured, and far more respectful of what the Umayyad Emirate was capable of. In the immediate aftermath, Abd al-Rahman II moved with the same decisive intelligence that had characterized every phase of his response. He did not simply celebrate and return to his palace. He recognized, with the same clear-eyed strategic thinking that had organized the trap at Tablada, that what had almost happened to Seville could happen again. The Norse had found the Guadalquivir once. Other Norse captains had heard about its wealth. The river was too useful, too accessible from the sea, too deep into the Emirate's economic heart to be left undefended. And so the Emir ordered the construction of a proper naval fleet, purpose-built warships, armed with the catapults and naphtha systems that had proved so decisive at Tablada, to be stationed permanently on the Atlantic coast and the lower reaches of the Guadalquivir. He ordered the fortification of Seville itself. The walls that had been too thin, too low, too easily bypassed were redesigned and rebuilt. Watchtowers were erected at intervals along the coast and river mouth. A chain of early warning stations designed so that the next time longships appeared on the horizon, the entire military apparatus of the surrounding region would be in motion before the first Viking warrior had even stepped ashore. This was the legacy of Tablada that modern historians often overlook. The battle was not just a victory, it was a reform. It transformed the way the Umayyad Emirate thought about its maritime vulnerability and forced it to develop the naval and coastal defence capabilities that would make subsequent raids exponentially more costly for any Norse force that dared to attempt them. But here, right here is where the story takes its most extraordinary turn. Not all of the Vikings went home. Among the captives taken by the Andalusian forces, men seized during the battle, during the retreat, during the desperate close-quarter fighting near the Islamic, there were those who made a calculation that was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable acts of practical pragmatism in the entire history of the Viking Age. They were alive. They were 3,000 miles from Scandinavia. Their fleet was ash on the Guadalquivir. Their leaders were dead, captured, or scattered. Their comrades were either dead or sailing north on whatever broken ships remained. They had no gold. They had no weapons. They had no passage home. And the Andalusian authorities, who had neither the appetite nor the logistical capacity for keeping hundreds of Norse prisoners, indefinitely, feeding them, guarding them, preventing escape in a country where they could not speak the language, offered them an arrangement. An arrangement that was simultaneously merciful practical, and in its own strange way, profoundly human. Convert to Islam, settle in Al-Andalus, live, and some of them did. Later tradition adds an extraordinary coda. Some accounts, especially in later scholarship drawing on Arabic material, say that a small number of Norse survivors remained in the lower Guadalquivir Valley, around places such as Coria, Carmona and Moron. In that version, they settled, farmed, raised livestock, and became associated with dairy products. This detail is famous because it is so strange. Raiders from the north, remembered later not only for ships and axes but for milk, animals and cheese in the Andalusian countryside. But it must be handled carefully. Modern scholarship notes that the conversion and cheese story is not as firmly sourced as the raid, the defeat, the burning of ships, or the executions. The safe version is this. A later Andalusian tradition connected some surviving magus with settlement and dairy production near Seville. It is a fascinating possibility, not a detail that should be presented as proven beyond doubt. Even with that caution, the tradition is too memorable to ignore. It captures something that military history often misses. Defeat does not always end with a neat line between victors and losers. Sometimes captives become settlers. Sometimes foreigners learn the language of the land that defeated them. Sometimes men who arrived as enemies are absorbed into the economy of the very countryside they once threatened. Whether the cheese story preserves literal memory, later embellishment, or a mixture of both, it points to a real medieval pattern: violence, settlement, conversion, adaptation, and memory blending together over time. Let that detail sit for just a moment, because even as a cautious tradition, it is one of the strangest footnotes in the Viking story. The men who had come up the Guadalquivir as raiders may have left behind in later memory an image not of conquest but of adaptation. Northern warriors remembered in the warm Andalusian countryside for animals, milk and cheese. It is not the ending a saga would choose. It is not the ending a warlord would carve into a boast. But history often has a sharper imagination than legend. There is one modern legend, however, that must be kept out of this story. The town of Coria del Rio near Seville really does have families with the surname Japon. But that surname does not come from the Vikings of 844 AD. It belongs to a much later story, the 17th century Japanese embassy of Hasekura Tsunenaga, sent by Date Masamune in 1613. Some members of that mission remained in Spain, and their descendants became associated with the name Japon. That story is fascinating in its own right, but it is not evidence for Viking descendants on the Guadalquivir. The real Viking legacy here is stranger and smaller, but better sourced. The Arabic memory of former Norse raiders who converted, settled, tended animals, and became known for dairy products in the lands they had once come to plunder. History is rarely this strange, and it is almost never this human. The Vikings did return to Al-Andalus in subsequent decades. In 859 AD, 15 years after Tablada, a major Norse expedition, later associated in some traditions with Bjorn Ironside and Hastein, pushed back into Iberian waters and then into the Mediterranean itself, reaching North Africa and raiding as far as the coast of Provence and the cities of northern Italy. It was an extraordinary expedition, one of the most ambitious Norse voyages of the entire Viking Age. Some accounts suggest they again approached or tested Seville, but they did not repeat the occupation of 844. They did not hold the city. They did not turn the Guadalquivir into a safe road for plunder. Tablada had taught its lesson. Or perhaps they had simply heard, in the harbours of Francia and Brittany, what happens when raiders push too far into Umayyad territory. That is the practical measure of Tablada's importance. The Vikings did not stop being Vikings. They did not stop sailing, raiding, trading, settling and terrifying coasts across Europe. But in Al-Andalus, after 844, the old confidence had to be recalculated. The river was no longer just a route to treasure. It was also a route into a trap. And what does it all mean? What does the Battle of Tablada, fought on a river plain in southern Spain on a cold November morning in 844 AD, tell us about the nature of history? It tells us that civilization is not passive, that the wealth and sophistication of a culture is not a weakness to be exploited by those with more swords and less philosophy, that there is a point at which culture and intelligence and organization become themselves the most lethal weapons on the battlefield. The Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba did not defeat the Vikings at Tablada, despite being sophisticated and learned and culturally advanced. It defeated them because of it, because its military system was the product of centuries of accumulated knowledge, because its cavalry had been bred and trained with the same care that its physicians applied to medicine and its architects applied to mosques, because its emir was a man who read widely, thought clearly, and understood that the most important decisions in a crisis are made not in the first hours of panic, but in the long, patient weeks that follow, in the logistics, the intelligence, the choice of ground, the timing of the trap. Abd al-Rahman II was not a trembling medieval king waiting to be ransomed. He was the ruler of one of the most advanced civilizations in Western Europe, a man who had built his state into a military, intellectual and cultural powerhouse of extraordinary capability. When the Vikings chose his city, they chose the wrong target. When the trap at Tablada snapped shut around their shield wall, the myth of Norse invincibility died in the Andalusian mud, hung from the palm trees of Seville for the whole world to see. The Vikings were many things: explorers, traders, raiders, warriors of genuine, terrifying brilliance, builders of the most sophisticated ships in the medieval world, settlers of Iceland and Greenland and, 5 centuries before Columbus, the coast of North America. They deserve the reputation that history has given them, not the horned helmet fantasy of Victorian Romanticism, but the real reputation: hard, capable, courageous, and at their best, genuinely extraordinary. But around the traditional date of November 11th, 844 AD, on the plain of Tablada, on the banks of the Guadalquivir, they encountered something they had never encountered before. An enemy that was smarter, an enemy that was faster, an enemy that had prepared the ground, chosen the moment, and executed the plan with a precision that left no room for Norse courage to find its way through. They were defeated, completely, decisively, in that campaign permanently. And a handful of them, in the strangest and most human possible coda to one of history's most dramatic military stories, planted roots in the rich Andalusian soil, learned new prayers, wore new clothes, spoke a new language, and made cheese. The dragon prows rotted into the mud of the Guadalquivir, the axes rusted. The songs the Scalds might have sung about this raid were never written, because no Scald ever survived to compose them, or because those who did return home had no words for what had happened that would not have shamed them before the fire. And in the warm valley south of Seville, in the towns that still line the great river, those extraordinary, improbable converts went on living in the land they had come to destroy and instead made their home. That is the brutal truth of Tablada. Not just blood and fire and heads on palm trees, but transformation. The transformation of an empire that refused to be broken. The transformation of enemies into neighbours. The transformation of a moment of catastrophic violence into something quietly, stubbornly permanent. This was 844 AD. This was the Emirate of Cordoba. This was Tablada. The plain of Tablada is quiet now. There is no monument there, no museum, no plaque in the ground marking the spot where the myth of Viking invincibility was broken here, in Andalusia, in the autumn of 844 AD. The Guadalquivir still flows south toward the sea, the same dark water it has always been. The palm trees of Seville still stand. The city is still beautiful, and if you walk the narrow streets of the old quarter on the right kind of evening, when the light is copper and low and the air carries the faint smell of the river, it is not impossible to imagine the echo of longships, the distant screaming of war horses, the soft crackle of burning oak on dark water. History does not always announce itself. The greatest battles are not always the most famous ones. The turning points that reshaped civilizations often happened in places that nobody remembers, on days that no holiday commemorates, between peoples whose names most of the modern world cannot pronounce. Tablada is one of those battles. A moment when the arc of history pivoted, when a civilization that had been told, implicitly, by decades of Viking impunity across Europe, that it was simply the next in a long line of victims, looked up, organized itself and said, no. What Abd al-Rahman II accomplished in the autumn of 844 AD was not just a military victory, it was a statement of civilizational identity, a declaration written in cavalry charges, burning naphtha, and public warnings after victory that Al-Andalus was not a prey state, that its gold was not free for the taking, that the sophistication of its culture was matched when necessary by the ferocity of its defence. The Emirate of Cordoba, at the exact moment that Western Europe was fracturing under Viking pressure, held its ground, more than held it. It crushed the threat so decisively that the Norse, who went back to England, France, and the rest of Europe and kept raiding for 2 more centuries, never again took Seville the way they had in 844, and the later tradition of cheesemakers in the Guadalquivir Valley, whether literal memory, embellished story, or a mixture of both, represent something that no war film and no saga ever really captures: the simple human truth that even hardened raiders, when history changes around them, may be remembered not only for violence, but for adaptation. That is the brutal truth of the Battle of Tablada. Not just blood and fire, but transformation. The transformation of an empire that refused to be broken, the transformation of enemies into neighbours, the transformation of a moment of crisis into a demonstration of what organised, intelligent, civilised power can do when it decides, truly decides, to fight back. This was 844 AD, this was the Emirate of Cordoba, this was Tablada. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, thank you, genuinely. It means everything that you are here, that you care about this history, that you want the real story and not the simplified version. This channel exists because of people like you, and I want to keep making it. Longer, deeper, better researched, more cinematic with every single video. If you want to be a part of that, if you want to directly support what we are building here, consider joining the Wars in History YouTube membership. The button is right below this video. Members get early access to new scripts and videos, behind-the-scenes research notes, and the knowledge that they are directly fueling the work. It is the most meaningful thing a viewer can do to keep this channel alive and independent. No algorithm, no corporate money, just history, told the way it deserves to be told, brutal, honest, and unforgettable. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next battle.